Welcome to this webinar about how to adopt DevOps at scale. Thank you very much for joining us today. The agenda for today is I will give a small introduction to the EXIN DevOps program and to the speaker, Adrien Blind. And then we will have a look at the DevOps certification program of EXIN. And then we will give the floor to Adrien for his presentation about scaling DevOps. And finally, there will be a Q&A session. Some practical remarks. You are all on mute. And if you have a question, please type it in the questions pane that you can see on the right. And your questions will be answered after the presentation. So I will present them to Adrien. This webinar will be recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording within approximately 1 day. My name is Rita Pilon. I'm a product owner at EXIN, and together with a colleague, we manage our certification programs through their life cycle. So from development to maintenance and localization, and in the end of life. And so one of the programs that we are managing is the EXIN DevOps certification program. We invited Adrien Blind. He is also Chief Examiner of the EXIN DevOps certification, and we asked him to share some of his knowledge regarding the scaling of DevOps. Currently he works at Sagi, which is a smart data platform handling the challenges and opportunities of data industrialization. He also worked at Société Générale, and there he was an evangelist and of DevOps, and he implemented disruptive technologies. He is also a Docker captain, and which means that he is a member of this illustrious group of DevOps experts and leaders. Now, before we go into the subject, I would like to show you the EXIN DevOps certification program. The EXIN DevOps exams are positioned in the Agile principles and culture domain of our portfolio, and which makes sense. There's a close relationship between Agile and DevOps. And we offer DevOps exams since 2016. In the program, we have 3 different modules on 3 levels. So DevOps Foundation is based on the book DevOps, A Business Perspective, written by Oleg Skrinik. And it tests the knowledge and understanding of the candidate of the terminology and the principles of DevOps. On the more advanced level, we have the DevOps Professional. And this certification is based on the DevOps Handbook, which you probably know. It's written by Gene Kim and others, and covers the 3 ways: flow, feedback, and continual learning. And this tests the candidate's capability and competencies, more the practice and how to work in DevOps teams. And on the highest level, we have the DevOps Master. It is mainly based on the book Effective DevOps, written by Jennifer Davis and Catherine Daniels. And it covers the capability and competence to guide DevOps teams and implement DevOps in the whole organization, which is actually also the topic that we are going to cover today. Since the release of the certification program, we offered approximately 10,000 exams, DevOps exams in 8 languages. The target group for DevOps is quite wide. I will not mention them all, but it's both in business and IT. It is for applications, but also for projects. It's about testing, development, operations, support, and lean IT practitioners, so a very broad target group for the certification. So now I would like to give the floor to Adrien Blind about the subject adopting DevOps at scale.
Adrien, you do have access right now.
I don't really have the buttons to move forward.
Can you test now?
I'm still, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you, Rita. So thank you for coming for this presentation about DevOps at scale. Today, I want to speak to you about scaling DevOps practice at the scale of a large company, but I don't want to speak only about theory. So what I will share to you today is really based on a concrete experience of pushing DevOps in a huge bank organization in its IT department, more specifically. So let's dig into this topic today. First, there is some lag. Okay. So the first thing is I will not speak about DevOps already. First, I want to speak to you more largely about continuous delivery practice, because it's really at the heart of such a transformation. Just to put some context of the bank I worked for, there was already an agile center responsible for pushing agile practices in the IT department. So the point was to reorganize development teams to work more iteratively and building incremental value. So this was something which has been already started as many organizations started to practice agile. But the point is, if you only focus on agility and do not consider DevOps and another practice I will explain in a second, which is the software craftsmanship, the point is you will not get values. Why? Because most of the times developers work in a more agile way. That's true. But the point is the developers are generating value which is never deployed in the same time by the ops people because they are not onboarded yet. And that's the point with DevOps. The second point is this program was focused on generating value for the business. The point is not only to insert a new practice in the IT department. The point is how to make the IT department generating more value to the organization. And the idea was to bring more value by being more able to help business to adapt rapidly to a short-paced market. And the second point was also strengthen the quality. Why? Because in fact, when you start generating value in a more iterative and incremental way, if you are not strengthening the quality, you will just have more issues and more issues getting in production. If you have some issues getting in production one time or another, it's fine. But if you are wanting to deliver value iteratively each week, each day, for instance, the point is you can't do it if you have not strengthened your delivery practice. For this, the idea was to get inspired from very different companies, the GAFAs, the web giants, and to focus on the operational aspects. The last point is really important. The point was to focus on practice and not the tools. The tools are just subsequent to the practices. If you only focus on tools, you are missing the value of it. So the point was to introduce 3 practices, not only one. Agility was enabling, as I said, the ability to deliver more fluently value, but it was only embedding the developers at the beginning. That's why DevOps practice has been introduced. Because in fact, when you are combining agility and DevOps, the point is the ability of developers to deliver more fluently the value is backed by people onboarded and able to deliver this value, these new softwares, in the same time up to production. And you can't do this if you are not strengthening your application, your code, and that's why the software craftsmanship practice enabled to build more robust and sustainable code through various set of practices. The program was organized, let's say basically. We had the foundation. The idea was to identify and adapt the new practices we wanted to introduce in the IT department of the company. We had also a deployment side of this program, which was responsible to spread these practices on the field. But it seems obvious, but the point is, right at the beginning, we understood that people building the foundations, building the theory of what would be DevOps and agility in this organization, were not in the contact of the field. They were not related to the deployment. So it was really important, and we understood this later on, that it was important that people responsible to structuring and building assets for this program were completely in contact of the people responsible to spread this program on the field, the coaches. So let's speak about the foundations. Here you can see a matrix which is summarizing all the practices we wanted to push in the organization. I used their 3 colors depicting each one of the practices I presented just before. If we focus on the purple one, the DevOps one, you can see that the point was to bring a large set of practices in the organization. For example, there was the infrastructure as code practice responsible for automating the ability to build up the infrastructure underlying to the applications we wanted to deploy. There was the point of enlarging the continuous integration platforms, the platforms which were originally there to build up softwares. The point was to expand their role to automate the delivery of the softwares itself. There was also an important point about the metrology. The point was to ensure that we would be able to understand what was happening to strengthen and optimize the processes, etc., etc. And you can see that for each of these practices, you can see on the bottom of the slide all these underlying technologies we wanted to push. So we pushed some configuration management DB softwares, tools such as Puppet, for instance, automation, deployment automation software such as Jenkins, some monitoring technologies, etc., etc. I will dig into this in a second. So here you can see an interesting slide, because this slide is summarizing what could be DevOps in an organization. What is also interesting with this slide is this slide has been presented to really high executive of this company. It's important to tell this, because in fact, to get such a transformation happening in the company, you need to have really high sponsorship, at least at CIO level or even more at executives level, because this kind of transformation requires a lot of money first, but more largely it requires people to push transformation at the heart of the company, because in fact it's not only about pushing new technologies, but it's more largely also to push a new mindset, a new culture, and new organizational patterns. And you can't enforce these organizational patterns if you are not having your executives pushing for this at the same time. And this slide was summarizing what would be DevOps in this company. So on one hand, it was to foster more relationship between people responsible for building up applications and people responsible for delivering and running these applications. It highlights the difference of cultures, and it also highlights the CAMS acronym, which stands for Culture, Automation, Measure, and Share, which is the acronym depicting generative DevOps. So in some way, the idea was to introduce some ops practices up to the development teams, for example, enhancing the measurement and metrology to understand what's happening. And on the other hand, it was to push some dev practices for operationals. One of the really important changes ops had to understood in such a change was operations. Infrastructure was just about kind of software, because in fact now running infrastructure is just about managing software, and it was really a cultural shift to introduce to the ops team. So here you have a slide depicting the kind of setup you have, but this is more commonly true for any kind of organization in a pre-DevOps concept. So you have the green bubbles representing teams responsible for softwares. So in these teams, you generally have business analysts, developers. These teams are aligned to their business lines. You may have in this bubble or in the second bubble what we call ops team, which are responsible for delivering and running this piece of software. And on the other hand, you have the ops teams, which are then responsible for running transversally infrastructure and systems. What is important here is you have what you call the wall of confusion. You have to notice that people in the green teams are focused on innovation and velocity, because in fact they are accountable towards the business, which drives them. While the blue teams, the infrastructure teams, are more focused on rationalization, stability, because they are transversally responsible for infrastructure assets. And so the one are angry when ops teams do not deliver assets they need to move forward rapidly, and the blue teams are not that happy to receive new assets too much rapidly, because they will be responsible for these assets on a long term. So that it leads generally to frictions. So the point is, in fact, create transversal teams made of business analysts, DevOps, and ops people, which are collectively responsible for building and delivering and running pieces of software. And since infrastructure becomes kind of software, you have specialized teams responsible for building and running infrastructure assets, which must be understood as a kind of product of the IT department. One of the practices we involved was infrastructure as code. This is one of the very first things I introduced in this company. The point was to make the IT department proposing to the application teams the same kind of assets you can have on the cloud today. So in fact, the idea is to enable the application teams to trigger creation, provisioning, configuration, etc. of the large set of infrastructure assets these application teams would need to push their software assets on top of. So we built up specialized product teams in this IT department, and they created a kind of Amazon Web Service set of services available to the rest of the IT department. One question could be, why doing so? Because in fact, I was working for a regulated company, and it was in an earlier time. Today, many more companies would just choose to shift to the public cloud to be able to trigger this infrastructure automatically without having to create such an automated product internally. The second thing, once you have created an automated platform for infrastructure, the point is to be able to expand the role of original software factories to be able to deliver the assets up to production. So tools such as Jenkins, Travis, these kind of technologies which were originally used to build up software products have been expanded to be also responsible to provision the underlying infrastructure assets and to deploy the application on top of it. So it's important here to notice that it created some radical changes, because in fact it changed the way you should think about your patching management and more largely infrastructure management context. Why? Because in fact, in a traditional company, generally speaking, what happens? Ops people are patching their systems. That's part of their backlogs, while application teams are patching their softwares. But when you are automating in such a way, the point is, in fact, people delivering applications are now responsible indirectly to patch infrastructure. Let's say this differently. Let's assume that you want to deliver a Java application on top of a server. In the past, you asked for a server with Java and, for example, a Tomcat software on top of it, and then you just have to deploy your application on top of it. Now you have automated everything. The point is you are not only delivering software. It's up to you to decide to provision a certain version of Tomcat, of Java, and of your system by yourself. So in fact, patch management is more and more triggered by the application delivery. You may have the same pattern using Docker, I will discuss in a minute. Docker is illustrating this. Why? Because in fact, in a Docker container, you do not only have your software package, you also have everything related to it. For example, if I'm speaking about my Java application, you will have the Java runtime. You may have an app server such as Tomcat and other dependencies, etc., etc. The point is, for application teams, a Docker container is just a new artifact, and so the really difference here is you're not only responsible for bundling your software. You are now bundling your software and all the underlying dependencies. So it means that as an application team, you are not only responsible for delivering software, you are delivering a whole product made of software and also underlying aspects. So it's one of the reasons why you need to onboard ops people in the application team, as I explained just before. Another important point is introduction of metrology. Of course, in any kind of organization, monitoring, supervision are at the heart of operations of the IT department. But the point here is to move forward and to expand up to metrology, because in fact the point is not only to be able to understand what happens and just to know if application works or not. The point is more largely to understand what's going on, what's happening, to have some feedbacks, to understand what to enhance in the software. So that's why it's really important to put metrology probes everywhere in your software to be able to enhance what you are creating. And this methodology is there to help not only operation teams, but also to developers and even business analysts, for example. Let's just give me an example there. For instance, I think about a piece of software we delivered. We had some people from the business which were responsible to decide when to push or some functionalities or to work on different parts of the software. And in fact, we introduced some methodology just to be able to know what features of the software people were using. So the idea was no business analyst and even business is knowing what actual users of the applications are doing with these applications. They were now able to tell, okay, we had many features to enhance in some part of the software that we just discovered that users are not using finally. So we'll change our priority according to what we observed. So you can see there that it's not only about monitoring, but more largely to be able to understand what's happening, to be able to enhance the applications. Well, that's, let's say, for theory. But the point is how to spread such practices on the field. Let me share to you what happened when we rolled out this program on the field in various application teams of the IT department. We did some awareness sessions and experimentations. The idea was to make people understanding what we wanted to propose to the IT organization and to make them touching the real sense of what we wanted to do. We involved people in serious game sessions, for example, playing with Kapla's piece of wood. And the idea in such serious games was to put developer people and ops people, each having their mindset, their cultural, and their own way of thinking in the same game. And this kind of game was the opportunity for them to understand that they each had a different way of thinking, and that they couldn't understand them each other. So the idea was to not directly address the point of their frictions and differences, because most of the time in this organization people are having some dollars. So the point was to explain this through some games. These onboarding sessions was mostly there to make people understanding the overall objective we wanted to introduce in the company. But the next point was to onboard them in the program. This onboarding has been done per application teams. The point was first to diagnose the status. We had created a matrix in which we were able to identify their maturity around agility, DevOps, and craftsmanship practices. The idea was to understand what was their status, and from there, from this diagnostics, decide what would be their own target. It's really important, this point, because in fact you can't try, you shouldn't try to onboard various teams having different level of maturity to the same target for different reasons. One of these reasons is in fact depending of the technological stack, depending of the agenda of this team. You may not need to onboard these teams to to move to the same direction. Let's give me an example. Let's assume in this IT department you have an application mostly focused on a mainframe. This is a stable application. There is not so much change in his roadmap. It's useless to try to make it adopting the whole bunch of practices I just defined before. While in different teams, in different contexts, you may want to push much more different practices to make these teams able of delivering much more fluently value. The idea was to set up a contract. It was a kind of moral contract with this team. Why? Because in fact, when you are pushing a diagnostic, when you are proposing them what we call the preferred future, in fact, the targets they should achieve according to their own agenda and context, the point is to engage them, to make them accountable of their own transformation. Because in fact, if you are not doing so, this team may accept the changes as long as a coach is there to help them to move forward. But once a coach has changed the team, they will completely stop practicing DevOps and agility. The idea was also to have a kind of pyramidal model, because in fact, of course, you can discuss at the same time agility, craftsmanship, and DevOps. But as you saw in previous slides, each of these practices have a lot of underlying concrete practices and corresponding tools. So if you are pushing some changes on all these axes at the same time, you are creating something, let's say, much more a mess. In fact, we tried to do this at the beginning, but in fact, you are not helping them at the end, because in fact, it's too much things, practices, and concepts to understand for them. So the idea was really to move forward step by step, practice per practice, and really to focus on what was bringing value. That's why there was not only a standard way and a standard target of maturity, but a maturity target to achieve corresponding to their own context and the value it would bring to this company, to this application. Once this diagnostic was made for the application team, a coach was onboarding the team. There was three kinds of coach: agile coaches, DevOps coaches, and also software craftsmanship coaches. And so as a DevOps coach, I was onboarding these kind of teams. And that's the moment where people are trying to tell you, okay, Adrien, your theory is interesting. We may see the value of it in theory. We saw what you explained in your awareness sessions, etc. But here, that's real life. You know, here it's different. It's complex. This is something you hear each time, and that's why the point is at the first time. The idea is that the coach at the beginning is there to show off. He shows off in general, then he shows off how to proceed in the context of the application team. And that's the point why coaches are really interesting for the organization. Coaches are close to the team. They are onboarding into the team for some time. And the idea is to show them that what you explained in more general sessions could be applied in their own context. Because in fact, you show them how to proceed, you show them how to work, you show them how to use such some technologies used in this DevOps landscape. But when you do this, that's only the first point. You need them to onboard them. So progressively, the role of the coach will be to help people of the team doing by themselves, and at the end, just to watch them working differently and pushing some advices, of course. But a possible problem is coaches are sometimes understood as people there to compensate the team. And when you are doing so, you are not really helping them in the long term. Things are just getting better when the coach is there. And once the coach is removed, the team is no longer working this way, and they're starting to work in an old fashion and having the same old problems they had. So the coach is really there to show up first, then to do together with people from the team, and then to release. Well, progressively, the coach is introducing new practices, such as the one I presented in the matrix at the beginning of the presentation. The idea is, for example, the coach was pushing continuous integration practices for people and applications and application teams which were not mature enough. Progressively, they explained how to proceed to automated deployment. Since you have CI to build up automatically software, now we'll explain you how to automate the delivery of this software. And progressively, you move forward practice per practice. Then, since you are now able to automate your deployment on existing environments, okay, let's now it's time to master how to automatically provision and deliver these underlying environments. And now you have a pipeline enabling to move from the code you write up to the ability to provision a new environment and put your software on top of it. Okay, that's for part of your overall application. You may have a pipeline for a feature or a microservice or something. Now it's time to push new practices. For example, you explain how to manage the code per branch, for example, in your code repository. You explain how to move from a single pipeline to several pipelines per microservices, for example. Then you add some new practices, for instance, Metrology, to be able to understand what happens in production to enhance things in your code and your delivery systems. Then you push new practices. For example, slicing. It's a more agile practice to explain how to slice the features you want to deliver in more atomic ways, etc. You push new practices such as string-based development, feature toggle. These are much more software craftsmanship practices, for example. Well, after some time, the coach or coaches, because you may have agile coach, DevOps coach, and also software craftsmanship coach, it's time to set the picture and decide and define where you are now. In fact, you are doing a new diagnosis to measure the journey the team had about the practice adoption. And the point is, in fact, there is no real end. In fact, the coach is there to learn new practices and to make the application team adopting these practices to use them even after the coach removal. But there is also a point about making the team able to adopt new practices on the long term, even after the coach has been removed. So in fact, a good practice is to introduce what we call pillars. These were senior people of these application teams, which were designated as local coaches, and these people were responsible being part of these application teams to to discover the practices, the new practices of the program, and to adopt them locally. In fact, it was the idea was to get these senior people grabbing information from the central program team and delivering locally as coaches, but in fact they were not real coaches. They were in fact senior people of the team responsible to relay the coach on a long term. And it's important to design to have someone in the application team being responsible to push and promote these practices on a long term after the coach has been removed. Because if you don't, the point is, in fact, the bad habits can come back quickly. For example, if there are some pressure, I observed several times that people would get back in their comfortable traditional way of working. So at the beginning, you must really ensure that you have locally people responsible after the coach removal, promoting and ensuring these good habits stay in the team. And since these local people are alone in their team, the idea is to create a kind of guild to make these people being able to emulate all together, and also to gather some content from the central program and having some consulting from help from the central team, so they could relay efficiently the practices locally after the coach removal. So as a conclusion, today's presentation was to speak about DevOps at scale, but I was wanting to enlarge the picture because in fact it's useless to speak about DevOps if you are not speaking about the same time about agility and also software craftsmanship, because in fact DevOps itself is only making the ability of the IT department to deliver much more fluently software. But this software must be built at the beginning much more fluently also. That's why agility must be combined with DevOps to observe real effect to the business, because in fact the overall objective is to ensure that the organization is able to deliver much more fluently value on the market through the software being built. An important point also is there, I didn't spoke too much about tooling, because in fact there are a lot of tooling on the market. I spent a few minutes to speak about the Docker for him because it's part of the story now for most of the companies. But the real point is to introduce a new mindset, a new culture. DevOps is mostly about culture and having underlying aspects in the organizational aspects and also in the technological aspects. But most of all, it's much more about culture and not only about pushing some tools. It's not because you are putting Docker, using some tools such as Jenkins and so to deliver much more automatically that you're doing DevOps. DevOps is really a different way to work, organizing people and teams differently to get value from it. You can't have a strong impact on a large IT department if you do not have a strong engagement of your executives. That's really important to have at least CIO level engagement, because in fact, pushing new technologies is quite easy in an IT department because it's one of the fundamental aspects of an IT department, being able to onboard new technologies. But you need executives to enforce some changes in the organizational aspects, because in fact managers are not the leaders, and so you have no people arriving, new people having impact on the organization, and you can't do this if you are not helped by the execs. There's not only one way to do some DevOps. Today, I wanted to share with you what I concretely did with, of course, many other colleagues in a large IT organization. There is no golden rule. There is not only one way to do some DevOps. That's the same with the famous Spotify organization that many people are speaking about when it's time to speak about agility. Spotify already said that they were not proposing a model. They just explained what they did in their own context. And that's the same with DevOps. There is no single theory and no single way to push DevOps principle in an organization. It's not only a question of tool. So you must adapt everything to fit your context, your technological stack, your organization, etc. So thank you for listening today, and I'm now ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrien. That was an interesting story about how we can elaborate DevOps practices in the organization, and specifically when you're talking from your own experience, it does make it real life, like you mentioned in your presentation. Yes, we do have questions. So the first one is there still any value or usability for IT service management processes like release management or change management, or is there no role at all?
It's a really interesting question, in fact. The point is still there. It's only the only difference is it is addressed in a different way. For example, for organization having ETL processes, and so there are some specific roles being depicted in the organization. These roles still exist. The point is to adapt the way they are working in a new context. To give you an example, I remind that in this organization, they were people responsible for validating things prior to move to pre-production and then production, as it exists in many organizations. There is no standard roles for this described in DevOps and Agile theory, but it doesn't mean that you do not need to add them. You can continue to add them because they were introducing some kind of security and confidence. So the only difference was to make these people interacting in the appropriate rituals of the teams. So, for example, for teams working in a Scrum way, there were some specific rituals at ends of the sprints where these people were onboarded, and that's the same for service managers, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you, clear. Another question is, in the context of operating the product that you are building, do agile teams who are building the product also support it in operation? So, for example, are they solving production issues? And doesn't that disrupt the development cadence that they have?
Interesting question also. I just moving back on the slide to, yeah, there. In fact, in a pre-DevOps organization, you have development teams only responsible for building up software and giving it to ops team responsible for delivering it and running it. And that's the two green bubbles in two different teams. In a more DevOps approach, you can see that the two first green bubbles has been merged in what we call a business product bubble. The idea is effectively to push business analysis steps and ops people in the same team, because in fact, when you are putting a team which is collectively responsible for both building and running the application, the difference is people are spending less time to tell that the problem is from the other team. Ops people are telling that it's in the code just to have not their objective impacted by the incident, while developer teams will tell it's an operational problem. When you are creating such an organization, the point is people are much more focused on working all together, because in fact they are collectively responsible for it and they are collectively impacted. It doesn't mean that developers are responsible for running the product. It just means that you are creating a small team onboarding both developers and ops people to ensure that the best friend of the ops people responsible for this application is the developers who has built up these applications. You create much more interactions between people building and running the applications, and the incentive is collectively on building and running. So in fact, the ops people will much more easily move to speak to the developers. And to give some example of concrete changes, part of the change is to make the people responsible for delivering and running an application working right on the same table, to give you an example, of the people who developed the application, because it helps to create some much more interactions. So the idea is really to change the organization from large IT pools, delivering and running transversally masses of applications they do not understand because they never have been onboarded and being part of the building process of this application. And you create organization of small teams which are responsible for both building and running the application. And so it do not only help people to ensure that problems are solved much more rapidly because they are working all together. It's also the opportunity to ops people to tell right at the time the product is being built what are their needs to be able to do their operations work correctly. In fact, too much often in pre-DevOps organizations, operational people are just receiving softwares to run, and they do not have been onboarded in the description of this application and the constraints they would have in execution. So onboarding them right at the beginning is to let them the opportunity to explain what they need to be able to operate this application correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, thank you. There's another question about at scale takeaways. So there is the sponsor involvement, which is a line of interaction and connection, and in a way also each team. And you explain that teams are, for example, app teams. Are there other takeaways from scaling? Is there a way of are there the points of connection of learning, for example, between teams?
Yeah, in fact, the idea for such programs is to both have in the same time having a central team which is responsible to depicting what would DevOps agility and software craftsmanship would be in the context of the organization, explaining coaching guidelines, recruiting and sourcing the coaches, which will be then used on the field to accompany the various teams. In fact, you have at the same time a central team responsible for sourcing coaches, building materials, doing some mass awareness sessions, having at the same time on the field coaches helping each an application team. And since these coaches have a central team, they gather some materials, some help, some supports, and it helps them to emulate with the other coaches when they need to have some help. And it's important because, in fact, after the coach is removed from the team you want to transform to the app team you want to transform, in fact, the central program is still there to promote content, to give some new awareness sessions, to onboard people. And in fact, when the coach has been removed from the local application team, the idea is the pillar, the senior guy responsible to continuing adoption and permanency of the practice, to have a central team which help him to have new ideas, to have new content, to get support from coach, etc., etc. So you need to, at the same time, have this central team coordinating, structuring, proposing standard guidelines, but having on-field people responsible for adapting, because there is no single way to do DevOps.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. And in your presentation, you also mentioned engagement of executives. And where do you start? Do you start on this awareness level within teams, or do you start with executive engagement, or both at the same time?
Really interesting question also. In fact, you can't just go to sponsors and ask them for strong support only based on theory of what would bring DevOps to the company. The idea is to get some support, to explain what you will try to move forward and on what you will try to do. And the real important point is to start changing things in one or two applications with some coaches and with a small central teams. These one or two first application teams you are transforming will be important for two reasons. The first thing is they will help you to strengthen your guidelines, to adapt your theory to the reality of the field, but also these one or two first applications will help you to have first victories. In fact, that's one of the reasons why metrology and measuring is important. For example, one of the things we measured was the time to market between the overall time to market. The idea was to measure the time between the moment where business is asking for something new to the application team and the moment that a solution corresponding to what has been expected by the business has been delivered and is running in production. And one of the metrics we were observing was the ability to reduce this overall time to market. And when you have some victories on the time to market, for example, on the number of deployments working correctly without failure, etc. The few things you are measuring is the opportunity to show off execs that you are concretely enabling the team to make it much more adaptable and reducing time to market. And when you are doing so, these are concrete things you can show off to your exec to get from them much more support and to get much more support. And it's important because, in fact, these victories enable you not to ask for some support for pure theory. You can show them that it works, and so it makes them much more confident about the thing that you can change the things.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And elaborating on how close Agile and DevOps are related or connected, do you have experience or have you seen an organization where there is no Agile head culture or way of thinking or working at all, and they are still trying to implement DevOps, and how would that work?
Well, I didn't see. Yeah, sorry.
Is thinking Agile or working Agile, is it a condition for being successful in DevOps?
I think that's the combination of DevOps and Agile that brings value to the organization. Because if you're only doing DevOps without agility, of course, you will get some benefits. For example, many people are reducing what DevOps is to only technical aspects, such as automating the delivery and automating infrastructure provisioning, for instance. That's part of DevOps, that's true. But DevOps is not only limited to this, as I explained before. And if what I saw from some organization I worked for, not this one, but some others, I saw this organization telling they were doing some DevOps because they were doing some infrastructure as code, they were doing some things which are parts of the DevOps landscape. But in fact, they were only getting some parts of the overall value you can get from DevOps. In fact, to get the overall value of DevOps culture and practice, you must first combine DevOps with agility first to get the real value of it. Because in fact, if you don't combine them, in fact, one of the limits you will have is you will not be able to deliver much more rapidly, because in fact you need to change the way the software is being built first. So that's why combination of the two practices is really bringing the most value of it. And people only speaking about DevOps without agility are only speaking about some part of DevOps. And generally, that's the most easiest part of DevOps, being the technical aspects of DevOps. Few years ago, I did a keynote for CTOs and CIOs in a conference. The name of my keynote was DevOps Human After All. The title was corresponding to a song title from Daft Punk, and the idea was to explain in this conference that many companies are introducing DevOps through its technical aspects, infrastructure as code, automating delivery, and that's quite natural because adopting new technologies is quite common. That's at the heart of IT departments. Then generally, in a second step, they are moving to the much more organizational aspect, because in fact, desiloting organization, putting ops in the same team as developers, etc., is about changing management, changing objectives, etc., etc. So that's really there where you need support of execs. And at the end, it gets even beyond, because at the third level, you need to change the human aspect of it. Because in fact, one of the key change of adopting DevOps is about making ops people understanding that their job is changing radically. It does not mean there is no longer need for ops, but it needs to explain them that the way they are working will be quite different. I remind that in this company and in other companies, I had some people which were not kind to change the way they were working. Why? Because some of these people were telling me, Adrien, if we help you automating operations, at the end we will no longer have work. So there are some fears you will have to fight. And I spent a lot of time to explain these people that the point was not there, because in fact the point was not to replace them with automation. The point was to change the way they would bring value to the organization, telling them that they would be less robots, human robots, because in fact, especially in ops teams, there are a lot of people responsible to applying some procedures, and no longer be robots and be much more robots makers. People being there not to be the robots, but being there to build up the robots. And that's some of the things you must introduce in your teams, and that's the most complex aspects, because in fact it's about reskilling, it's about working differently. One of the most important message I had to push in organizations in my consultant life was to explain ops people that from now they would be developers, of course, specialized developers, but no, they would have to consider that doing operations in this new world would be about being a specialized developer. Because in fact, provisioning a server is now about developing a script to do so and automating this kind of things. And explaining them was really complex, because in fact, you must understand that for organization, for developers, agility, even if they are not practicing this already, they already heard about, and adopting agility is quite natural, and DevOps is the next thing. It's quite logical for them. But most of the time, when you are going to ops people, they were not they were not trained, or they were not even informed of what agility would be, and so they have a lot of things to understand at the same time compared to developers. Operational people have to learn at the same time. First, that their work is changing. They are now being developers. So everything developers are doing, versioning their code in a Git or something, system, etc. All these practices should be learned. At the same time, they need to learn to develop. They need to learn new skills. They need to learn new way of working, new way of interacting with the application teams, etc., etc. And so it's really important to take care of them, because if you don't engage them correctly, you can create some fears and having some strong pushback from this kind of people, and it may make your transformation journey failing.
Yes, I find that a really beautiful message to end this webinar with. The State of DevOps report also mentions psychological safety on top of the improvement drivers. And what you say is that we have to make clear what other added value people can have in this context. And so yes, in the end, it's all about people. Thank you so much, Adrien, for your presentation and for your elaborations. And so I also want to thank all the participants in this webinar and all the questions that you have asked. Like I said, we will send you a recording of this webinar and also the slides that Adrien showed us. And well, we wish you all the best, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much.